I found the last presentation very interesting and challenging to think about entrenchment of ideas and power issues and so forth. But we're going to talk about mixed methods right now, and it's supposed to be what is mixed methods, but I had to change it to what are mixed methods. And I do want to tell you that I think the whole thing around mixed methods has been increasing in momentum, partly because people just come to the conclusion that using mixed methods makes sense. And that when I was in graduate school, a very long time ago, I was taught only quantitative methods. And as soon as I worked in high poverty areas, I said, well, these quantitative methods are great, but they're not telling the whole story. And so I started to learn more about qualitative methods, and it happened to be about the time that qualitative methods were being introduced, and there was a lot of argument about quantitative versus qualitative. And so the good news is that there's now a community of scholars who are saying, well, let's just look at mixed methods and see what that means when we approach it from different frameworks. And you'll see this reflected in the Journal of Mixed Methods Research, which is now about 10 years old. I was the editor for 5 years. We've always had co-editors, one in Europe and one in the United States. It's a very internationally based journal. There's also the Mixed Methods International Research Association, which was just established about 3 years ago and has had international meetings every other year and then regional meetings in the year between. This is an international year. In August we'll be in Vienna. So Mixed Methods International Research Association, MMIRA, has a website, and if you're interested in things about mixed methods, you'll see a scholarly community that has dedicated itself to civil discourse about the meaning of bringing methods together. And so those advancements, I think, are important. I'm going to start with very basics, as that was what I was instructed to do when we talk about mixed methods. What are we talking about? I'll give some examples, and then I'm going to explore different framings for mixed methods designs, because the frame that you use will influence the other decisions you make about who to involve, how to involve them, what kind of questions to ask, what kind of designs to use, and so forth. And so we're going to kind of just move through this quickly. Sage has a book that I just published in 2018, Mixed Methods Design and Evaluation. So if you're intrigued by things I talk about here, you can go downstairs and look at it and just flip through it and go, oh, okay, now I have a better understanding what she's talking about. Anyway, so this definition of mixed methods comes from the Journal of Mixed Methods Research. There's a lot of language that gets used, and sometimes people will say, well, I'm including case studies with the phenomenological, so maybe that's mixed methods. According to the Journal of Mixed Methods Research, that's not mixed methods. You might call that multiple methods according to this way of defining. And it does come down to the collection and analysis of qualitative and quantitative data. Why be that narrow about it? Because we'd had journals that would publish qualitative stuff, and we'd had journals that would publish quantitative stuff. And it was people going, but I use both. Where do I put my, where do I publish? And so the Journal of Mixed Methods Research was an outlet for that. But, you know, because I write extensively about this, I'm always searching what's being published, and now we're seeing more and more journals publishing mixed methods studies. And so that inclusion of qualitative and quantitative, very, very important, the integration of the data at various levels or stages of the study. So it's not sufficient to say, I did this quantitative part, I did this qualitative part. They didn't talk to each other. I published the quantitative part, the qualitative part. We wouldn't consider that to be mixed methods unless there's some integration. And it can be done in a single study, it can be done in a sequence of studies. It's methodologically eclectic. There's, you know, sometimes when I read the literature, it'll be like, well, we did a survey in a focus group, okay? You can do that, and that would be mixed methods, and sometimes that's appropriate. But all kinds of methods can be used, and very creative kinds of methods. I mean, we just heard Andy talk about surveys and citizens juries. It's a mixed methods. If you're combining that quantitative, qualitative, and it's eclectic. And this is important too, the synergy between the quantitative and qualitative aspects of the study. You learn something different because you put the data in conversation with each other. You learn something different that you would not have understood or known by having the separate sets of data. And so it's that synergy that really makes for the mixed methods. And when I talk about mixing quantitative, what am I talking about? Quantitative, qualitative, exactly the things you're all familiar with. You can use anything, experimental, quasi-experimental, causal comparative, correlational surveys, single case designs where they're quantitatively oriented, qualitative, group processes, focus groups. I work with indigenous communities. They have their own forms of group processes. Case studies, ethnography, phenomenological, participatory action research. But in my mind, mixed methods are most likely to be the approach of choice when you need to integrate community perspectives into the inquiry process, because the need to have that qualitative interaction, and I would call just about every moment that I'm in the process of conducting a study as opportunities for collection of qualitative data, because I'm talking about relationships, building relationships. How do we do that? What does that mean? What's the quality of those relationships? Yes, we still collect numbers, but to have the beginning point, one of trying to understand through qualitative processes to inform the mixed method study. So I've been a part of studies that have used almost all of these things in combination, and I've certainly seen in the literature the combination of these. Now, when I said that I was raised quantitative and then qualitative came along, and people actually got kind of acrimonious, and they were calling each other names and saying, oh, you qualitative people are just telling stories, and then the qualitative people say, oh, you guys have no idea of the context, you're collecting numbers that don't have any meaning. And so we had what we called the paradigm wars, and it wasn't really an argument about method. It was an argument about the assumptions that guide the methodological choices. And that's really where a lot of the conversation around paradigms and what does that do in terms of informing your methodological choices. And so we had post-positivism that was really an advocate for randomized controlled trials, but not just as a methodological choice, but because there was an assumption about the nature of reality that guided that. That said you can measure something within a certain measurement error, and that would give you knowledge that would be valid. And we had constructivists saying, no, we have multiple constructions of reality, and therefore our methodology needs to be able to capture those multiple constructions of reality, and in order to do that, qualitative methods are more likely. So in the mixed methods community, we still have representation from these paradigms. People from a very strong post-positive stance are saying, yeah, you can use mixed methods. You'd use them differently than if you were working from more of a constructivist framing. And if you read a lot of the literature coming out on mixed methods, people are talking about the use of a pragmatic framing, pragmatic philosophy that guides. It's actually not being used in the way of pragmatism of like Thomas Dewey and so forth, but more as a practical, if I have a research question and it can best be answered with quantitative and qualitative data, then I should use both of those kinds of data. So practical approach. And then we have the transformative, and this is looking at first, the pragmatists are saying, well, I have a research question and I might need quantitative and qualitative data. And transformative people would say, where did that research question come from? Did you engage with the right people in order to come up with that question? Is your understanding of the context and the issue sufficient for you to move forward with the collection of data without engaging in other processes prior to that should be included in the design of your study. And so the transformative really came from my experience in working with members of marginalized communities. For 35 years, I taught at Gallaudet University, which is a university for deaf people. It's the only university of its kind in the world. And I learned a great deal about the meaning of exclusion and marginalization and power and diversity from the people that I was teaching and interacting with. And they were saying, you know, the way research is being done, you're just not getting our experience right, or you're completely ignoring us. You know, are you going to have people who are deaf in the citizen juries? Well, that's going to require a lot different kind of accommodations and support. And if you say no, because that's expensive, we don't have money for the interpreters, then what's the effect of the exclusion of that? And so working in that context and realizing that the deaf society is really a microcosm of diversity across the world. Deaf people are all genders, sexual identities, economic status, language, so forth and so on, colors. It really taught me how to work with marginalized communities with those ideas of inclusion. So what we're going to do in the short time that we have is to look at what would it mean to frame your mixed methods study, what kind of questions would you ask, and post-positivism and mixed methods. Methodologically, it would have a dominant quantitative aspect with probably the use of randomized controlled trials, although not essentially. Quasi-experimental designs are used. So the mixed methods qualitative would be included, but the quantitative would be dominant. Okay, so when I asked Howard White, I don't know if you're familiar with him, but he's very active in the promotion of randomized controlled trials and international development, particularly about the use of mixed methods. He said, well, Donna, really, this is all you would need to know, is that we had an intervention and we have, you know, the experimental control group, and then we look at the impact, and everything in between really doesn't matter. Because if we see a significant effect at the end, we know because of the randomized controlled trial that it was that caused the impact. But I said, well, Howard, come on now. Let's talk about mixed methods and whether or not there's a place for qualitative in there. And he said, well, the question you should ask is, did the intervention make a difference? He says, in the state of the world. And that question can best be answered with quantitative experimental or quasi-experimental designs. Randomized control trial is likely to be the best available method for addressing this attribution question. And then you see a little note down there, if it is feasible. And so he's saying, you know, really, if you can do it, that's the best thing you can do. But this is where he, you know, lets qualitative sort of come in. Mixed methods combine the counterfactual analysis from an RCT with factual analysis using quantitative and qualitative data to analyze the causal change. So the factual analysis, in other words, sort of the qualitative part, will address issues like the quality of the implementation. How was that treatment implemented? Targeting who's in there, barriers to participation, and adoption by intended beneficiaries. So that wouldn't be data you'd collect strictly within RCT, but if you were adding the qualitative part, the mixed methods part, then you would say, well, let's look at how we can incorporate that. And I'm going to use this example of gender-based violence and sexual harassment in schools. So if I were working from a post-positivist perspective, I would say, well, what can be done to reduce gender-based violence and sexual harassment? How effective is the treatment? How was it implemented? Were appropriate students included? What barriers to participation occurred? Okay, so that would be the type of questions that I would answer. And this might be the design. A mixed methods design, beginning with, of course, the review of literature and the selection of the intervention, pre-testing of gender-based violence, sexual harassment, knowledge and attitudes, demographic survey, random assignment to treatment and control groups, and then this is temporal, this is pre, This is during the implementation, so there might be interviews. Are there barriers to participation? How is it being implemented? Through observations, interviews, document reviews, and then this is at the end of the treatment, post-testing of knowledge and attitudes and comparison of treatment and control groups. So we see the dominant part is still the quantitative part, but inclusion of qualitative in order to understand were there barriers here, how is it being implemented. Now, if we moved to the pragmatic paradigm where this is such a brief touch on these paradigms. It's not really fair to them, but I'm trying to just capture the highlight of what would distinguish these. Matching methods to questions and the use of mixed methods would be the assumption that would guide your methodological choices. And they introduced the language of concurrent and sequential design. So you could have qualitative and quantitative happening at the same time, concurrent design. If one sequence of quantitative first, then qualitative, or qualitative first, then quantitative, then sequential design. So you'll see that language if you're reading in the literature. What kind of research questions would they ask? Well, does the intervention change the attitude? Still, they'd ask that because they want to know that. Do the students gain knowledge about gender-based violence and sexual harassment? Was it implemented according to plan? How willing are the teachers to participate? Have you ever worked in schools and asked teachers, it's really I just want to randomly assign the kids. And the teachers are like, no, you're not. You're not going to do that. Parents resist. They say, no, you're not doing that. How can the program be improved? So a pragmatist might say, why did they change the question just a little bit? Did the students gain knowledge? Because maybe they found out that the teachers are unwilling to go through that random assignment. And so they're going to adopt a design that might be just a little bit different. Again, looking at this as sort of the pre, during, and after stage. Also doing review literature, selection, intervention, demographic, give pre-test. Interview teachers to assess willingness to participate. So now we're not going to be in a randomized situation because the teachers have to say, yes, I'm willing to participate, I'm willing to be randomly assigned, and they say, no, I'm not. Going through the middle part might look a lot like the interviewing for barriers, the implementation, and then at the end you see the sequential post-testing of gender-based violence and sexual harassment knowledge and attitudes, comparison of pre to post-test, interviews of students and teachers to determine strengths and weaknesses of the program, because the school said, if you're going to do this, we want to know how we can make it better. It's a very practical question, so collect the data that will give us the answers to the questions that we have. Okay, so framing it from a pragmatic might lead to this kind of design. Constructivists would primarily emphasize the collection of qualitative data, but with quantitative data added to make a mixed method design. And so we might see a different kind of set of questions that would come from a constructivist who is designing mixed methods. Questions about effectiveness and implementation are still in the design, but they might say, well, how well did the recruitment procedures work? Who did we actually get into the program? How well did the intervention respond to culture and context of the target population? To what extent does the target population reflect the range of diversity with regard to the overall goals? Who's left out? Why are they left out? How well does the target population understand what they're consenting to? Of course, we all go through the informed consent, and we go, yeah, sign it. But if we actually do constructivist approaches to it, we try to really understand how it's being understood, and that's a different process. To what extent do participants accept the outcomes of randomization or are willing to participate? If you're interested in following it more from a constructivist point of view on mixed methods, Charlene Hess-Biber's written some good stuff about it and continues to publish. And so we might see a little different mixed methods design here, still having the review of literature, maybe doing some interviews with the staff and the students about recruitment strategies and their prior experiences with gender-based violence and sexual harassment. So not jumping in and saying, well, I already know what it means to you, so we're going to go ahead with an intervention. Still, you can do the demographic survey, but you might be more tuned in to, well, who's being included, who's not. Use of pretests, interview teachers about willingness to participate, interview students, do they understand the meaning of randomization, understanding the concepts, are they willing to be randomized? And then through the middle, also seeing interviews with students about the cultural responsiveness of the treatment. Have we made assumptions about this treatment? You know, just give it to experimental group and control group, see if it works. Maybe there's issues around it that are making it not palatable in terms of cultural issues. What kinds of barriers are they experiencing? What strategies are available to overcome those barriers? So we're starting to see, trying to get into the richness kind of data that a constructivist would be attuned to. Post-testing, comparing pre and post, interviewing students to determine strengths and weaknesses, asking about cultural responsiveness, and maybe doing follow-up interviews with the students about their experiences with gender-based violence and sexual harassment. So we see more emphasis on qualitative data being collected here and trying to get to those rich understandings that qualitative data can provide for us. Now, moving on to transformative, because our time is very limited now, transformative lens. Lucky for you, if you come to the keynote tomorrow, you'll get more about this lens. The focus is on human rights and social justice, being culturally responsive, very action-oriented, and the use of mixed methods fits within that lens. The basic design for transformative would begin with a phase of building relationships. Who do we need to include? How do we need to include them? What are the working strategies? Doing a contextual analysis and a needs assessment. What's the history of this phenomenon in this community? What other things have been done here? What have people's experiences been? What are the dimensions of diversity that are relevant within this context? Who's been included? Who's been excluded? The piloting an intervention, having process or implementation, research, effectiveness, and utilization, because remember one of the things I told you, the quality principle for transformative is it being action-oriented. So including in the design opportunities for use of what is being collected. Now this is the generic transformative mixed methods model design that it's only taken me about 40 years to develop. But the notion that we begin with a cycle of building relationships, reviewing literature, individual and group consultation, and developing working strategies, including that in the design, because sometimes we kind of jump in and think we know what we're supposed to do. Contextual analysis is the next phase, and there's nothing sacred about the methods that I have listed here, but they're methods that I've used or I've seen other people use that have allowed them to get a better understanding of the context through focus groups, surveys, use of extant data. A lot of databases out there, we can get better understandings, literature, GIS mapping, if we're talking about where are the safe places for you to be, where are the places that you don't feel safe, this kind of GIS mapping. Identification of value positions, what's driving the decisions about what kind of interventions are needed and who should be involved with them in the development of the intervention, the piloting of the intervention, very concentrated data collection there, observations, interviews, photos, voice, focus groups, surveys, pre-post data collection, and team meetings. The team meetings that I've observed in that phase are one of the most crucial parts of having a daily debriefing to say, well, what happened today? And how can we change it? What's working well? What's not working well? Moving on to the implementation, determination of the effectiveness. I want to also just say that, the data on unexpected outcomes, being aware of that. Post-data collection that we might expect to see about the effectiveness anyway, but also data about the relationship quality, because remember, down here we started with relationships. And so what we want to do is examine the quality of those relationships and then use how do we engage for the use with transformative purposes, for policy change, to refine the intervention, and to improve and expand on the relationships that started. Because we want it to be sustainable. We want action to be sustainable. Okay, so we don't have time to go through most of the other things that I could tell you about transformative today. So let me just end with this is just a sampling of the kinds of research questions that you might ask if you were using a transformative lens. How would you identify the cultural norms and beliefs that might be operating in that community? How would you identify the dimensions of diversity that are associated with discrimination, oppression, and power differences? How would you take into account the expertise, knowledge, and strengths of the community? That's that relationship building. It's saying people in the community, they know things. And they need to be included as experts from the knowledge that they bring. And how can we provide a platform for authentic engagement between the researcher and the community? That I'm not just the expert come here to collect data, but how will we work together so that I respect what you bring, I learn from you, and we do things better. We implement things in a better way. We collect data in a better way because of this mutual respect that we have. Okay, so that's it for what are mixed methods and different framing. Usually I teach that in a full-day workshop, so you guys are brilliant. 20 minutes to get it all. And I think I'd be happy to talk with anyone afterwards because I think our time might be up.
Well, thanks very much, Donna.